Skyrim in the classroom. Today we're going to talk about authentic real-world learning in a virtual fantasy-based environment. Skyrim, or The Elder Scrolls Part 5 Skyrim, is a fantasy-based video game, anchored in the tropes of Dungeons & Dragons or Lord of the Rings style wizards and warriors focused fiction. The game itself, as the name implies, is the fifth in the series of Elder Scrolls games, but in no way requires the player to be familiar with the previous four iterations. Much like studying history, knowledge of what came before might make for a richer study in connections, but Skyrim can be experienced as a case study on its own. The game was released originally in November of 2011 and has been re-released on multiple platforms in the 7 years that have followed. It is available on PC, PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360 or Xbox One, and most recently on Nintendo Switch. Personally, I have, somewhat foolishly, purchased the game 4 times over 3 of those platforms. The name Skyrim itself refers to the setting of the game, a province of the fictional continent of Tamriel. The province of Skyrim is meant to reflect a Nordic wintry setting in a Borean forest, essentially a medieval fantasy set in Norway of the Middle Ages. It is a snowy, lonely environment populated with the occasional city or village that bustles with activity and life. Connecting Skyrim with various strands of the intermediate/senior curriculum is, at least for this proto-educator, an easy thing to do. Applying Skyrim to the Politics in Action Grade 11 Open course, there is a lot of potential to weave the political inquiry strand into the story of the game. Specifically, A1.5 used the concepts of political thinking when analyzing and evaluating evidence, data, information, formulating conclusions, and/or judgments about issues of political importance. The game pits two political factions against each other, the Imperial Army and the Stormcloaks. One is the dominant hegemonic political force, and the other is an oppressed separatist colonized faction that rebels and seeks independence. The player has the choice of where to apply their allegiance and playstyle, and personal choice, as well as ethnic makeup of their chosen character, can all factor into the decision. Having students analyze and compare experiences either in relation to the other faction could be valuable and a transferable skill. Additionally, to have students examine which choices they made consciously, unconsciously, what they had autonomy over, and what they were directed to do, as well as their natural inclination towards the oppressor or the oppressed, would make for rich contextual analysis of their own real-world political situation. Using Skyrim as a lens, students can compare their gameplay experiences with their personal experience of situating themselves politically. Students can reflect on what allegiances they chose, what was chosen for them, the reasons why, and how that ultimately affects the quote-unquote gameplay of their lives. In the Introduction to Anthropology, Psychology, and Sociology curriculum, there's a few opportunities to utilize Skyrim as well. Under the specific expectations of anthropology, there's explicit reference to the research methods of archaeological excavation under sections B1.4. As a case study of colonial practices, an indicator that a culture's age is not what determines its level of sophistication, a teacher could present an Issues Relating to Archaeology unit, with Skyrim as the scaffolding tool. Much of Skyrim involves crypt robbing and delving deep into ruins and ancient tombs, often to steal the material wealth that lies buried. Sometimes the culture that your character encounters is that of the mechanical and industrial level, decidedly different from the tone of the rest of the game. Having students seek out real-world exemplars of this seemingly fantastic phenomenon could be an excellent opportunity to explore concepts of cultural sophistication and the misconceptions that accompany it. In general, Western belief is that any culture that we excavate must be primitive compared to ours. Skyrim, with its shifting and bending the narrative by having robots appear in underground ancient tombs, disrupts that misconception. So students can compare to case studies of England in the Dark Ages, and I use that term deliberately, having evidence of Roman roads and advances, such as aqueducts, but no clue how to replicate it despite it being older. This archaeology unit could be a good introduction to some truth and reconciliation themed issues, as students could be introduced to the valuable notion that indigenous culture pre-contact was not less sophisticated than European due to its lack of capital, countries, and kings. It was just different. Keeping with Intro to Anthro, Psych, and Soc, under the D2 Explaining Social Behavior section is a ton of opportunity to use Skyrim to discuss the sections D2.2 explaining the relationship between prejudice and individual and systemic discrimination, as well as D3.2 describe ways in which social structures, economic, family, class, gender, and race affect individual and group behavior. Using the storyline of Skyrim, students could explore and examine these themes. Depending on the fictional ethnicity you choose for your character, your gameplay will unfold, highlighting certain factional prejudices and stereotypes. I personally tend to play as a Khajiit, which is to say a cat person. They're essentially giant bipedal cats. They're typically viewed as thieves and face crude insults and prejudice on that basis. Examining the effect of these negative stereotypes and prejudice in this laboratory setting, divorced from any individual's real-world prejudices, might be a more constructive way for students to come to some important conclusions about how individuals and systemic discrimination work. Skyrim could also be a fascinating case study for students to learn about how social structures of class affect individual and group behavior. Your character begins the game as a downtrodden, penniless, possessionless prisoner being prepped for execution, much of what you're seeing in this video. Some fantastic events occur to spare your life, but it is at the behest of the rich and powerful Jarl, combination monarch/mayor, that your life is continually spared, so you can perform work for him. Your character only gains passing societal respect once he or she has attained enough wealth to buy property. The complex layers of social structures for students to write about and explore could foster some rich learning without the taint of our own messy real-world prejudices to spoil the lesson. Grade 11 English, Reading and Literature Studies strand, there is a host of applications so implicit I won't belabor its inclusion, but suffice it to say the story of Skyrim presents opportunities to include reading for meaning by way of making inferences in section 1.4, so looking for use of foreshadowing with the text or story of the game, as well as understanding form and style, such as section 2.3's elements of style, so analyzing the tragic and lonely tone of the game and its impact on the reader, or in this case the player, and discussing why its inclusion in this way and how it's done. I think Skyrim could hypothetically be used as a case study tool in the classroom. Groups of 5 or less would play the game together, exploring predetermined themes and presenting them to the class. Students can create a Let's Play or Prezi with screenshots to illustrate their findings and the game's broader curricular connections. In an ideal classroom, students would play in their groups on the Nintendo Switch and dock the Switch on a projector to accompany the presentation. When it comes to James Paul Guy's What Video Games Have to Teach Us learning principles, I think quite a few of these actually apply to the use of Skyrim. I'll go over a few of them just quickly. Number 1, the active critical learning principle, that all aspects of the learning environment, including ways in which the semiotic domain is designed and presented, are set up to encourage active and critical, not passive learning. I think its inclusion in a game like Skyrim is somewhat implicit, right? The game is, by way of its nature, active and critical. Students sort of have to reflect and decide on the choices that they're making and how that will affect their gameplay going forward. So it's not passive learning whatsoever. They literally have to engage with this. Number 6, the psychosocial moratorium principle. Learners can take risks in a space where real-world consequences are lowered. That's sort of what I was referring to when I was discussing the somewhat laboratory setting of Skyrim. I think that that concept of being able to play with constructs of race and ethnicity and prejudice in this situation where no one's actual real-world feelings can be hurt or sensibilities could be transgressed against, I think delving into that in this somewhat fictional setting is actually a really interesting way of asking yourself, why do you come up with these beliefs or structure things on these particular notions in this laboratory setting where it's okay if I sound somewhat prejudiced towards these Argonian lizard people because my cat people and they don't get along. It's, you know, almost somewhat humorous, but you have to actually question yourself, why is it that you feel this way? Why do you behave in this manner? Just quickly, Guy's identity principle. Learning involves taking on and playing with identities in such a way that the learner has real choices in developing the virtual identity and ample opportunities to meditate on the relationship between new identities and old one. There's a tripartite play of identities as learners relate and reflect on their multiple real-world identities, a virtual identity and a projective identity. Again, I think this is all sort of inherent in what I've been talking about, in which the student or learner could reflect on what it is that they actually perform out in real life as opposed to what choices they make in these video games, and how something that can seem somewhat absurd, you know, a race of cat people and lizard people, say, not getting along seems so absurd and fantastical in this fantasy environment, but they're kind of called upon to reflect for themselves how they're possibly enacting that in their own daily lives. And I think the ways in which students could discuss that and sort of learn from that could be quite rich. I think Skyrim has a lot of potential learning opportunities. It might be difficult to get it into the classroom ubiquitously, but I do think there's a lot of potential here.